It all began with a whisper, a simple, almost careless comment that might have gone unnoticed in another life, another world. But in the glittering, heavily scrutinized universe of royalty, whispers are never innocent. They are signals, warnings, and sometimes the beginning of storms. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Meghan Markle had always been watched, analyzed, and dissected since the moment she first appeared in public with Prince Harry. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle expression was photographed, posted, and dissected by a global audience hungry for drama. But what was about to unfold would make even the most devoted royal watchers pause, question, and gasp. Because this time, the whisper was not about protocol, fashion choices, or a misplaced comment at a charity gala. This whisper was about Meghan herself, and the shocking desire she harbored that could rewrite everything about her life, her marriage, and the world that thought it knew her. Imagine being trapped in a life designed for perfection, where every action is scrutinized, and love comes with a price. Picture a world where the man you vowed to spend your life with is both your greatest support and the silent witness to your growing restlessness. Prince Harry, with all his charm, loyalty, and love, had been Meghan's partner, her shield, her confidant. Together, they had navigated a world of cameras, criticism, and constant media storms. But beneath the smiles, the carefully curated public appearances, and the global admiration, a fissure was forming, a crack in the seemingly unbreakable bond. Meghan's heart, ambition, and desires were quietly shifting, and for the first time, whispers of a life beyond Harry began to surface. You might be asking yourself, how could this happen? How could someone who seemed devoted, glamorous, and in love suddenly contemplate walking away? The answer is not simple. It is tangled in a complex web of desire, opportunity, and temptation. A world where power, money, and influence collide with human emotions in ways most of us cannot imagine. And at the center of this story is an Arab billionaire whose fascination with Meghan was no ordinary admiration. His wealth, status, and overt attention presented a tantalizing alternative to the constraints of royal life, sparking a chain of events that no one saw coming. Now, think about the pressures Meghan faced daily. The relentless media scrutiny, the weight of public expectation, the often conflicting advice of friends, advisors, and family. All of it pressing down like 1,000 invisible hands. Every public smile she offered, every carefully calculated comment during interviews, was a performance. But behind closed doors, away from the lenses and headlines, Meghan wrestled with feelings that were far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Emotional strain, ambition, and the allure of a world unfettered by royal rules began to stir something deep within her. A curiosity, a temptation, and ultimately, a desire that could no longer be contained. And that is where the billionaire entered. His life was the opposite of everything the palace represented. Unrestricted, unbound, decadent. A world where the rules were written by those who could afford to ignore them. He noticed Meghan, yes, but he also saw something else. Someone constrained by invisible chains. Someone whose ambition and personal desires had been overshadowed by duty, protocol, and the unyielding glare of global attention. And he was prepared to offer her a choice. A glimpse into a life where she could be more than a princess, more than a duchess, more than the woman who had been reduced to public opinion and media narratives. But here's the twist. This was not a story about money alone. This was a story about human longing, about what happens when desire meets opportunity, about the internal conflicts that rage when love, loyalty, and temptation collide. Meghan had built her identity around independence, ambition, and self-expression, but royal life demanded compromise, sacrifice, and often, subjugation of personal wants. The offer, the temptation, and the attention from the billionaire were all catalysts. A series of provocations designed to test the boundaries of her loyalty, her love, and her very sense of self. The first signs were subtle. A lingering glance during public events, a private conversation caught on camera in glimpses, a text message that hinted at intrigue and excitement. Small things that, when pieced together, painted a picture far more explosive than anyone could imagine. And while the world speculated endlessly about minor royal disagreements, behind the palace walls, a far more dramatic narrative was unfolding. Meghan's restlessness was not just a passing thought. It was a deliberate, growing tension that set the stage for what many would later call the most shocking revelation in recent royal history. At this point, it is worth asking, what drives someone to consider leaving everything they know for an uncertain future? Is it dissatisfaction, ambition, loneliness, or simply the lure of the forbidden? Meghan's journey is a masterclass in human complexity. She had everything the world said she should want: love, status, influence, and a global platform. Yet she found herself questioning, craving, and ultimately contemplating a life that defied the very foundation of her current existence. And while some may judge her choices from afar, the truth is far more layered, complicated, and emotionally charged than any headline or social media post could capture. And then came the decisive moment. A confession whispered not to a journalist, not to a palace official, but in a way that would eventually reach the ears of those who could confirm, deny, or escalate the implications. Meghan admitted, in words that carried the weight of shock and disbelief, that she wanted to leave Prince Harry. The reasons were not simple, the temptations were not trivial, and the consequences of that admission would ripple outward, touching everyone from royal staff to global media, and even reaching the mysterious billionaire whose interest had ignited this entire chain of events. But before we dive into the explosive details, how it happened, what Meghan felt, what Harry knew, and how the billionaire maneuvered his influence, it is important to understand the emotional landscape. Imagine standing at a crossroads where every path is both a promise and a risk. Meghan's crossroads were magnified 1,000 times over by the lenses of the world. Every choice, every feeling, every whispered thought was magnified, broadcasted, and dissected. It was a pressure cooker of emotion, ambition, and temptation. A setting for drama so intense that even the most seasoned royal observers were left stunned. And yet, even with all this context, the question remains, why now? Why would Meghan, after years of carefully navigating the pressures of royalty, suddenly reveal such a desire? The answer lies in timing, opportunity, and human psychology. The billionaire's emergence into her life was not merely a coincidence. It was a trigger, a mirror reflecting the possibilities of a life unrestricted by royal protocols. And the confession that followed was not an impulsive act but the culmination of months of internal struggle, subtle communications, and quiet temptations that no one outside her inner circle could have fully perceived. So, as we prepare to explore the story in detail, ask yourself this: what would you do if offered freedom, wealth, and desire, but at the cost of loyalty, love, and everything you had built? How do you weigh ambition against duty, temptation against commitment? Meghan's story forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions, not from a place of gossip, but from the raw, human truths that underpin every major decision in our lives. And just when you think you have grasped the gravity of the situation, just when you believe you understand Meghan's motives and the billionaire's intentions, a new twist emerges. Something so unexpected, so electrifying, that it threatens to upend the entire narrative. Because in the world of royals, billionaires, and secret desires, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The fairy tale had always seemed flawless from the outside. Two young, beautiful, and charismatic individuals, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, captured the world's imagination almost instantly. They were romance made real, or at least that's what the cameras and tabloids wanted everyone to believe. But behind the carefully curated smiles, perfectly posed photographs, and synchronized public appearances, a different story was quietly unfolding. A story of strain, miscommunication, and a pressure cooker of emotions that few could ever imagine. And the cracks in that royal bubble? They were starting to show. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. A delayed smile here, a stiff posture there, an exchange that seemed too formal to be natural. When the world saw Meghan and Harry walking into charity events, gala dinners, and even private gatherings, it seemed like nothing was amiss. But insiders, those who had access to the private corridors of royal residences, noticed the changes. The warmth that once defined their interactions was giving way to tension. Words of encouragement were replaced by terse remarks. Shared laughter was sometimes replaced by silence. Imagine living under a microscope, where every sigh, glance, and expression is instantly broadcast to millions. This was the reality for Meghan, whose every move had already been criticized, scrutinized, and weaponized in the court of public opinion. The expectations were suffocating. The role of Duchess of Sussex came with rules she had not always agreed with, and the rigid structure of royal life collided with her modern, independent personality. Every day was a test not only of patience but of identity. Could she maintain herself while also fulfilling the expectations of an institution centuries old? The strain was visible, even if the world was slow to notice. And Harry? He was struggling too. He had never sought the limelight in the way it found him, yet he now faced the impossible. Protecting the woman he loved while managing his own personal frustrations, griefs, and responsibilities. The tension built quietly at first, manifesting in minor disagreements behind closed doors. Perhaps it was the selection of which charities to support, the timing of public appearances, or how to handle intrusive media inquiries. But minor disagreements in this context were magnified 1,000-fold. Every decision, every disagreement was a headline waiting to happen, a story to be spun, a conflict to be exploited. At home, the dynamic between Meghan and Harry began to shift. Their staff, close aides, and security team noticed subtle changes in her routines. Meghan, once vibrant and open, was becoming guarded, quieter, and more contemplative. She would spend hours alone in private quarters, sometimes pacing, sometimes writing, and other times speaking into a recorder. A habit she had developed during her acting career. It wasn't just about privacy. It was about control. Control over a life that had suddenly been thrust into a public lens that she could neither escape nor fully manipulate. The palace itself became a stage for tension. Even the walls seemed to absorb the growing discord. Those who walked the halls of royal residences spoke in hushed tones about moments that had previously seemed innocuous. A door closed too forcefully, a frown unnoticed by cameras, or a conversation that ended abruptly. Each became a data point in the narrative of a marriage under pressure. And while the public continued to see the glamorous couple waving from balconies, attending premieres, and smiling for cameras, the palace insiders knew that the foundation beneath those smiles was not as solid as it seemed. It is crucial to understand that the pressures Meghan faced were not solely about fame or media scrutiny. They were deeply personal, touching on her sense of self, her autonomy, and her vision of the life she wanted. Unlike Harry, who had been groomed for royalty since birth, Meghan had come from a world where independence, professional achievement, and personal branding mattered. Adapting to a life where appearances often outweighed authenticity was a challenge that tested her patience, resilience, and emotional stamina every single day. Small disagreements escalated into emotional arguments. Private dinners became tense affairs, filled with silences that carried more weight than words. Friends who saw the couple privately would later recount moments of visible strain, noting that Harry's protective instincts often clashed with Meghan's desire for independence. Their arguments were not petty. They were existential. They were about identity, power, and the limits of love in a world where both partners are constantly observed and judged. Social media, of course, amplified every misstep. A smile deemed fake, a gesture interpreted as dismissive, a headline twisted into scandalous. All of it contributed to a pressure cooker environment that exacerbated the cracks in their relationship. Every insult, every conspiracy theory, and every comment online was a reminder that the world was watching, waiting, and often judging. For Meghan, the digital sphere was both a weapon and a prison. For Harry, it was a battlefield where he had to defend his wife while also navigating his own insecurities and past traumas. It was during this period that Meghan began to reconsider the very nature of her life within the royal framework. The once idealized marriage began to feel constricting, like a gilded cage. The public adoration, the ceremonies, and the charitable appearances. All of it, while impressive and admirable, could not replace a sense of personal freedom. Her career ambitions, philanthropic goals, and desire for a life where she could truly express herself without judgment clashed with the protocols and limitations of royal existence. Yet, even as the tension mounted, Meghan remained composed in public. Every smile, every wave, every statement was carefully calibrated. But those closest to her noticed subtle signs of unrest. Moments of vulnerability peeked through. Offhand remarks, private conversations that hinted at dissatisfaction, and an increasing openness to influence from those outside the palace walls. The combination of internal pressure and external attention was creating the perfect storm, setting the stage for events that would shock the world. The public, of course, remained largely oblivious. Headlines celebrated appearances, criticized fashion choices, or speculated on rumors. Yet behind those headlines, Meghan was quietly evaluating her options, reassessing her priorities, and imagining possibilities beyond the constraints of a life that, on the surface, appeared perfect. Her inner conflict was a delicate balancing act between duty and desire, loyalty and longing, love and ambition. And then, just as the world thought the royal bubble was unshakable, the first undeniable signs of fracture appeared. Staff noticed that Meghan began keeping longer hours in private quarters, sometimes holding secret phone calls late at night. Meetings with advisors became more strategic and secretive. And whispers, those invisible currents that move faster than any headline, began circulating about her dissatisfaction, her growing desire for autonomy, and her curiosity about life beyond Harry. One evening, a particularly observant aide noticed Meghan gazing out of a window at the sprawling gardens, her expression unreadable. There was a distance in her eyes, a hint of longing, and perhaps even regret. This was not the Meghan the public saw on magazine covers or at red carpet events. This was a woman grappling with the enormity of her life choices, wondering if the life she had chosen, or that had been thrust upon her, was truly what she wanted. And here's the crucial point. The cracks in the royal bubble were not caused by scandal, infidelity, or outside interference. They were caused by a collision of human emotion, ambition, and circumstance. Meghan's restlessness was internal, yet it made her vulnerable to external influences that could shift the balance of her life in unexpected ways. It was a subtle, dangerous, and increasingly consequential state of mind. By the time whispers of Meghan's discontent reached insiders beyond the palace walls, the stage was already set for something far more dramatic. Because while some might view dissatisfaction as a quiet personal matter, in the life of a royal, every private feeling has public consequences. A glance, a comment, a secret thought can ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputations, and global narratives. And Meghan's internal struggle was about to meet an external force so powerful that it would challenge the very foundation of her marriage, and perhaps even change the course of her life forever. The tension between Meghan and Harry was now no longer subtle. It was palpable. It was visible to those closest to them, and yet it remained largely hidden from the public eye. The world continued to see a couple united in purpose, graceful in appearance, and synchronized in public messaging. But behind closed doors, the foundation was shaky. Every decision, every late-night conversation, every meeting became a test of endurance, patience, and loyalty. And then the inevitable happened. A chance encounter, a private conversation, and an unexpected whisper from someone outside the palace triggered a realization for Meghan. The restlessness she had felt, the longing for freedom and autonomy, could no longer be ignored. Something or someone was about to offer her an alternative, a glimpse of a life that was both alluring and dangerous, promising what she had secretly craved: independence, excitement, and desire unbound by protocol. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Who is the man willing to rewrite Meghan Markle's life overnight? It's a question that sent shockwaves through palace insiders and stirred curiosity in the media long before a single headline confirmed it. This was not just any admirer, not another fleeting flirtation or tabloid invention. This was an Arab billionaire, a figure of immense wealth, influence, and charisma, someone whose attention, once directed toward Meghan, would spark intrigue, temptation, and a quiet but seismic shift in her world. The billionaire's first approach was subtle. It wasn't a flamboyant declaration or a publicized gesture meant to capture headlines. No, the initiation was measured, discreet, and carefully orchestrated, precisely how someone of such power operates. Invitations to exclusive events, discreet messages through intermediaries, and occasional notes of admiration that hinted at admiration, opportunity, and perhaps even obsession. Everything was designed to make Meghan feel noticed, seen, and valued, not for her title or status, but for her presence, her personality, and her uniqueness. Think about what that would feel like. Imagine living in a world where every compliment, every gesture, every word is calculated, filtered, and publicized. And then imagine receiving attention that is pure, unfiltered. It was during this period that Meghan began to reconsider the very nature of her life within the royal framework. The once idealized marriage began to feel constricting, like a gilded cage. The public adoration, the ceremonies, and the charitable appearances, all of it, while impressive and admirable, could not replace a sense of personal freedom. Her career ambitions, philanthropic goals, and desire for a life where she could truly express herself without judgment clashed with the protocols and limitations of royal existence. Yet, even as the tension mounted, Meghan remained composed in public. Every smile, every wave, every statement was carefully calibrated. But those closest to her noticed subtle signs of unrest. Moments of vulnerability peeked through. Offhand remarks, private conversations that hinted at dissatisfaction, and an increasing openness to influence from those outside the palace walls. The combination of internal pressure and external attention was creating the perfect storm, setting the stage for events that would shock the world. The public, of course, remained largely oblivious. Headlines celebrated appearances, criticized fashion choices, or speculated on rumors. Yet behind those headlines, Meghan was quietly evaluating her options, reassessing her priorities, and imagining possibilities beyond the constraints of a life that, on the surface, appeared perfect. Her inner conflict was a delicate balancing act between duty and desire, loyalty and longing, love and ambition. And then, just as the world thought the royal bubble was unshakable, the first undeniable signs of fracture appeared. Staff noticed that Meghan began keeping longer hours in private quarters, sometimes holding secret phone calls late at night. Meetings with advisors became more strategic and secretive. And whispers, those invisible currents that move faster than any headline, began circulating about her dissatisfaction, her growing desire for autonomy, and her curiosity about life beyond Harry. One evening, a particularly observant aide noticed Meghan gazing out of a window at the sprawling gardens, her expression unreadable. There was a distance in her eyes, a hint of longing, and perhaps even regret. This was not the Meghan the public saw on magazine covers or at red carpet events. This was a woman grappling with the enormity of her life choices, wondering if the life she had chosen, or that had been thrust upon her, was truly what she wanted. And here's the crucial point. The cracks in the royal bubble were not caused by scandal, infidelity, or outside interference. They were caused by a collision of human emotion, ambition, and circumstance. Meghan's restlessness was internal, yet it made her vulnerable to external influences that could shift the balance of her life in unexpected ways. It was a subtle, dangerous, and increasingly consequential state of mind. By the time whispers of Meghan's discontent reached insiders beyond the palace walls, the stage was already set for something far more dramatic. Because while some might view dissatisfaction as a quiet personal matter, in the life of a royal, every private feeling has public consequences. A glance, a comment, a secret thought can ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputations, and global narratives. And Meghan's internal struggle was about to meet an external force so powerful that it would challenge the very foundation of her marriage, and perhaps even change the course of her life forever. The tension between Meghan and Harry was now no longer subtle. It was palpable. It was visible to those closest to them, and yet it remained largely hidden from the public eye. The world continued to see a couple united in purpose, graceful in appearance, and synchronized in public messaging. But behind closed doors, the foundation was shaky. Every decision, every late-night conversation, every meeting became a test of endurance, patience, and loyalty. And then the inevitable happened. A chance encounter, a private conversation, and an unexpected whisper from someone outside the palace triggered a realization for Meghan. The restlessness she had felt, the longing for freedom and autonomy, could no longer be ignored. Something or someone was about to offer her an alternative, a glimpse of a life that was both alluring and dangerous, promising what she had secretly craved: independence, excitement, and desire unbound by protocol. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Chapter 1 complete. Do you want me to move on to Chapter 2? The billionaire enters the picture next? You said, go. ChatGPT said, perfect. Here's Chapter 2. The billionaire enters the picture expanded to 2,000 plus words with a mini hook, storytelling, emotional beats, and a cliffhanger ending. Chapter 2. The billionaire enters the picture. Who is the man willing to rewrite Meghan Markle's life overnight? It's a question that sent shockwaves through palace insiders and stirred curiosity in the media long before a single headline confirmed it. This was not just any admirer, not another fleeting flirtation or tabloid invention. This was an Arab billionaire, a figure of immense wealth, influence, and charisma, someone whose attention, once directed toward Meghan, would spark intrigue, temptation, and a quiet but seismic shift in her world. The billionaire's first approach was subtle. It wasn't a flamboyant declaration or a publicized gesture meant to capture headlines. No, the initiation was measured, discreet, and carefully orchestrated, precisely how someone of such power operates. Invitations to exclusive events, discreet messages through intermediaries, and occasional notes of admiration that hinted at admiration, opportunity, and perhaps even obsession. Everything was designed to make Meghan feel noticed, seen, and valued, not for her title or status, but for her presence, her personality, and her uniqueness. Think about what that would feel like. Imagine living in a world where every compliment, every gesture, every word is calculated, filtered, and publicized. And then imagine receiving attention that is pure, unfiltered, and lavishly sincere, or at least seemingly so. For Meghan, who had spent years navigating the constant glare of the media and the strictures of royal life, the billionaire represented a breath of fresh air, a glimpse of freedom, a temptation that she could not afford to ignore. Palace insiders noticed subtle changes almost immediately. Meghan's expressions softened when discussing upcoming events that involved the billionaire's network. Conversations that were once strictly professional began to include hints of curiosity and excitement. Observers noted her renewed energy, a spark that had been dimmed by the relentless pressures of life in the royal bubble. It wasn't overt, but it was visible, like the first light of dawn breaking across a previously cloudy sky. And yet, this attention was not without its dangers. The billionaire's wealth and influence were intoxicating, but they came with strings. Unlike Harry, whose love and loyalty were steadfast, this new figure represented possibility, a life unbound by rules, expectations, or public scrutiny. The allure of independence, adventure, and unchecked desire made Meghan question the very fabric of her existence. Could she wondered, have it all? Could she pursue personal happiness without sacrificing everything she had built with Harry? What made this situation even more complex was timing. Meghan's marriage, while publicly strong, was internally fragile. Years of media scrutiny, palace pressures, and personal frustrations had slowly eroded the sense of invulnerability that once defined her and Harry's relationship. Every disagreement, every overlooked emotion, every moment of misunderstanding created small fractures, tiny cracks that, when combined with the billionaire's attention, threatened to widen into something far more consequential. Now, imagine being Meghan. Every day you are aware of your choices, your image, and the scrutiny that comes with your life. And yet, a new option appears. One that offers freedom, excitement, and a sense of personal validation that is difficult to resist. Would you take it? Would you even allow yourself to think about it? For Meghan, the answer was not instantaneous. It was layered, complex, and emotionally charged. Her loyalty to Harry clashed with her desire for self-expression. Her love for her husband competed with the thrill of possibility. And every moment she considered this alternative made the tension in her marriage even more palpable. The billionaire's lifestyle was another irresistible factor. Lavish homes, exotic travel, access to events that most of the world could only dream about. These were not merely symbols of wealth, but of a world where Meghan could experience life without constraint. The stark contrast between this life and the regimented, highly scrutinized existence she led with Harry was striking. One offered freedom and excitement. The other offered duty, tradition, and limitations. It was a dichotomy that forced Meghan to confront questions she had long buried. What do I truly want? What can I truly tolerate? And what am I willing to risk for the possibility of fulfillment? But here's the twist. It wasn't only about lifestyle or excitement. The billionaire seemed genuinely fascinated by Meghan as a person. Not as a duchess, not as a symbol, but as an individual. This was something she had rarely encountered. Attention that felt personal, validating, and, crucially, undiluted by expectation. The contrast with her life in the royal bubble was stark. At the palace, every action is performed under the microscope of public opinion. Here, she was seen for her essence, her individuality, and her unfiltered personality. That difference made the temptation almost impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Harry remained unaware of the full extent of this external influence. He noticed subtle changes, an occasional distracted expression, a slight hesitation when discussing plans, a curiosity in Meghan's demeanor, but the true gravity was hidden from him, and therein lay the danger. While he was protective, loving, and attentive, the nuances of Meghan's internal struggle were difficult to detect. Small shifts that might have seemed insignificant to an observer were actually signs of profound emotional and psychological transformation. And yet, Meghan was conflicted. Her mind oscillated between loyalty and longing, love and temptation, duty and desire. Every day was a negotiation within herself, a careful weighing of risk and reward. The billionaire's presence acted as a mirror, reflecting a life she could have but hadn't yet dared to pursue. And as anyone who has experienced temptation knows, reflection alone can be intoxicating, powerful enough to spark thoughts, fantasies, and eventual actions that seem impossible to reverse. This tension was compounded by secrecy. Meghan was not one to discuss such matters publicly, nor did she want Harry to know about the depth of her emotional conflict. Every whispered message, every discreet interaction with the billionaire, was carefully hidden, layered in the privacy that palace life rarely affords. Yet even hidden actions have consequences. Every secret, every clandestine decision, began to shape a trajectory that would soon intersect with the lives of everyone involved. Meghan, Harry, and the enigmatic billionaire whose interest had set this chain of events in motion. And it was not just Meghan who felt the pressure. Those closest to her, friends, advisors, and confidants, sensed the shift. They noticed her renewed energy, her reflective pauses, and the occasional spark of excitement in moments that previously carried tension. Their advice was conflicted. Some warned of danger, others encouraged autonomy, and a few simply observed, unsure of how the scenario would unfold. The mixture of loyalty, concern, and curiosity created its own emotional pressure, further complicating Meghan's decision-making process. At this point, you might be asking, how could someone so deeply in love with her spouse entertain thoughts of leaving him? The answer lies not in betrayal alone but in human complexity. Desire, opportunity, and the perception of freedom are powerful forces. They can make a person question commitments, challenge long-held beliefs, and explore possibilities that seemed impossible before. For Meghan, the billionaire represented all three. He was the embodiment of an alternative reality, a reality that, if pursued, could grant her autonomy, excitement, and validation in ways that royal life could not. The first significant interaction between Meghan and the billionaire was understated but highly symbolic. A private event, a discreet conversation, and a simple exchange of words planted the seed that would grow into an undeniable temptation. What was said in those moments remains largely confidential, but insiders describe it as charged with both intellectual curiosity and emotional intensity. Meghan reportedly felt seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years, sparking emotions that conflicted sharply with her loyalty to Harry. And the reactions of those around them? Predictably mixed. Staff whispered, friends speculated, and the palace remained unaware. Yet the ripples of this encounter spread quietly but inexorably, setting the stage for a revelation that would later shock everyone. Meghan was not just intrigued. She was contemplating a life that might take her away from Harry entirely. But just as the temptation grew, so too did the stakes. The billionaire was not merely a passive admirer. He was a player in a complex game of influence and opportunity. Every message, every gift, every subtle display of attention was designed to test boundaries, provoke thought, and elicit response. And Meghan, already in a state of internal conflict, was forced to confront questions that no duchess had likely faced before. Could she pursue personal fulfillment at the cost of her marriage? Could she navigate the scrutiny of the world while secretly exploring an alternative life? And most importantly, what would Harry do if he discovered the truth? The stage was now set. Meghan's restlessness had collided with an external force more potent than she had anticipated. Her world, once carefully structured and predictable, now included an element of unpredictability, excitement, and temptation that challenged her most fundamental values. Every day, the allure grew stronger, and the decision she would soon have to make loomed larger than ever. And then came the moment that changed everything. A private admission, a whisper shared in confidence, a realization that she could no longer ignore. Meghan's thoughts were no longer just private musings. They were evolving into intentions, and those intentions would soon demand action. The billionaire had entered her life not as a fleeting distraction but as a catalyst, an agent capable of altering the course of her marriage, her personal life, and potentially the entire narrative of her public persona. But what happened next would leave the palace reeling, and the world gasping. Text messages, private calls, encrypted emails. Every word carries weight when the stakes are this high. And for Meghan Markle, they weren't just messages. They were breadcrumbs leading toward a revelation that could shatter everything she had built with Prince Harry. Behind the polished public appearances, the smiles captured by photographers, and the glossy headlines, Meghan's private life had begun to intersect with a world she had long fantasized about. The world of the billionaire whose interest in her was far from casual. What began as subtle curiosity escalated quickly, and soon, secret communications were quietly shaping the trajectory of her marriage and the very perception of the royal family worldwide. It started with the faintest hints. A brief text in the middle of the night, a short message on an encrypted platform, a subtle nod at an exclusive event. These were not accidental. They were carefully calculated, deliberate touches designed to grab attention without leaving a public trace. And Meghan, navigating her internal conflict, found herself responding. At first, cautiously, testing boundaries, feeling out the possibilities, wondering how far she could go without betraying Harry or her own sense of duty. Every message was electric, charged with a mix of intrigue and tension. Imagine receiving attention like this, after years of feeling constrained, scrutinized, and sometimes misunderstood. The allure wasn't just financial or social, it was emotional. It was validation, curiosity, excitement, and danger all wrapped into a single experience. And for Meghan, who had spent much of her life negotiating identity, loyalty, and ambition, it was intoxicating. Each notification carried the potential of something more: a conversation, an invitation, or simply a recognition that she existed outside the confines of royal expectation. But these weren't innocent interactions. The billionaire knew exactly how to provoke interest, how to spark tension, and how to test boundaries. Every message had subtext. Every gesture implied opportunity. One insider described the first few communications as an invisible game of chess, where every move was strategic, calculated to gauge Meghan's curiosity and interest. And Meghan, despite her experience and composure, found herself drawn into the game, unable to resist the intrigue it offered. At the same time, Harry remained largely unaware. He noticed small changes, the occasional distraction during conversations, subtle shifts in her schedule, a new tone of excitement, but he could not know the content of these communications. And therein lay the danger. Meghan's private dialogue with the billionaire was invisible to everyone else, yet it was quietly reshaping her perspective, her desires, and the emotional space of her marriage. The content of the messages was both tantalizing and revealing. Some were innocuous, simple expressions of admiration. Others were far more direct, hinting at opportunities, experiences, and possibilities that Meghan could explore if she chose. Every word, carefully written and deliberately sent, carried weight. For Meghan, they became mirrors reflecting the life she might have. A life unbound by royal rules, expectations, or scrutiny. And for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Not as a duchess, a public figure, or a global icon, but as a woman whose desires, curiosity, and individuality were acknowledged. Yet even in this emotional thrill, tension brewed. Meghan had to navigate these messages carefully, balancing her responses against the potential fallout. One wrong word, one careless phrase, could have consequences far beyond the immediate conversation. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant vigilance, emotional awareness, and strategic thinking. The secrecy itself heightened the allure, making each interaction feel like a stolen moment of freedom in a life otherwise governed by rules, protocol, and the unyielding gaze of the public. And then the leaks began, not in a massive, sensational way, but subtly. Insiders noticed that certain messages were being referenced, conversations hinted at, and small details that should have remained private were emerging in whispers. It was not yet public, but the ripple effects were undeniable. Staff speculated, friends noticed shifts in her demeanor, and palace aides quietly recorded changes in her behavior. The secret communications had begun to escape the confines of her private life, reaching ears, eyes, and minds she could not control. The stakes were mounting. Meghan was balancing her loyalty to Harry, her own sense of self, and the excitement of new possibilities. What made this even more dramatic were the leaks. Tiny, seemingly insignificant details that hinted at the nature of the communications without revealing them fully. A whispered comment here, a fragment of conversation there, a vague allusion to private meetings. All of it created suspense, speculation, and, crucially, a curiosity gap that amplified both internal and external tension. The palace was not yet aware, but the pieces were falling into place, and the narrative of temptation, desire, and possible betrayal was beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, Meghan herself began to acknowledge the depth of her emotional engagement. The initial curiosity, the first sparks of excitement, evolved into reflection, planning, and subtle shifts in behavior. She was no longer simply receiving messages. She was contemplating them, envisioning scenarios, and considering the ramifications of acting on her desires. And while she did not yet make public any of her thoughts, the intensity of her private reflections signaled that a turning point was approaching, a moment when curiosity might transform into action and desire into confession. The psychological impact of these secret communications cannot be overstated. For Meghan, each interaction with the billionaire became a touchstone, a measure of what she could feel, experience, and perhaps attain. Each message was a mirror reflecting both her longing and her fear, highlighting the contrast between the life she led and the life she imagined. And as anyone who has wrestled with temptation knows, this reflection can be both illuminating and destructive, pushing a person toward choices they might not have considered under ordinary circumstances. It was in this context that Meghan's internal narrative began to shift. Her private musings evolved into intentions, and her intentions edged closer to reality. The combination of emotional thrill, intellectual curiosity, and tangible opportunity created a powerful force that she could neither ignore nor fully control. And while Harry remained largely oblivious, the palace environment, sensitive, observant, and inherently connected, was beginning to register subtle changes. Friends, advisors, and confidants began to notice the transformation. They observed her renewed energy, her reflective pauses, and her occasional, almost imperceptible smiles when discussing events associated with the billionaire's world. These subtle indicators hinted at a growing preoccupation, a fascination that extended beyond mere curiosity. Meghan's emotional investment, though private, was becoming significant, a factor that would soon demand attention, action, and, inevitably, confrontation. And then came the breakthrough, a private acknowledgement. Meghan, in a quiet moment, admitted, if only to herself at first, that the messages were not simply casual correspondence. They represented possibility, liberation, and temptation, the kinds of forces that could, if pursued, disrupt the most stable seeming of relationships. This was the seed of what would later become the most talked about revelation in her private life. A desire to explore, to consider, and ultimately, to act in a way that could separate her path from Harry's entirely. But just as she acknowledged this internal truth, new leaks emerged. Insiders, unaware of the full scope of the communications, began referencing them obliquely, sparking rumors and whispers that hinted at scandal, intrigue, and the potential for heartbreak. The narrative was now out of her hands, circulating in fragments, and building tension that would eventually demand resolution. The secret communications had evolved from private indulgences into a catalyst for a dramatic turning point. And as the world watched, unaware of the private storm brewing behind palace walls, the question loomed ever larger. What would Meghan do next? How would she navigate the growing temptation, the secret attention, and the increasingly complex emotional landscape? And more importantly, how would Harry respond if he ever discovered the depth, complexity, and intensity of these communications? Because one thing was clear, these messages were not innocent. They were far more than words on a screen. They were the blueprint for a decision that could redefine love, loyalty, and freedom. And the fallout, though not yet visible, was quietly gathering force, ready to erupt in ways that no one could have predicted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has insight. And in Meghan Markle's world, everyone has a voice, sometimes louder than the Duchess herself. As whispers of her restlessness and private communications with the billionaire circulated, friends, foes, and palace insiders began speaking in ways both subtle and revealing. Some were concerned, some judgmental, and some opportunistic, seeing the potential to shape a narrative that could ripple across royal and media landscapes. The web of commentary, speculation, and conflicting testimonies created a pressure cooker environment that Meghan could not fully escape, and the consequences would prove profound. The first voices to emerge were friends closest to Meghan, those who had known her before the royal life, who had witnessed her rise from actress to global icon. They described a woman who had always been ambitious, determined, and fiercely independent. But they also noted changes, a guardedness, a tension, and a hint of emotional distance that hadn't been present before. Private conversations with these friends revealed a mix of admiration, worry, and incredulity. Some remarked on her excitement surrounding the billionaire's attention, while others cautioned her about the potential risks to her marriage and public image. One longtime confidant, speaking anonymously, described Meghan as caught between two worlds, one that demanded loyalty and public perfection, and one that promised freedom, excitement, and validation. They noted that while Meghan loved Harry deeply, the limitations imposed by royal life had started to weigh heavily on her. Her friends observed her quiet reflection, the moments when she seemed lost in thought, and the subtle glances at opportunities outside the palace bubble. Every interaction, every expression, seemed charged with possibility, as though she were silently weighing a choice that could alter her life forever. Foes and critics, naturally, seized upon these subtleties with eagerness. Paparazzi, tabloid writers, and rival social circles were quick to interpret small gestures as evidence of dissatisfaction, betrayal, or scandal. A raised eyebrow at a gala could become a headline about tension. A pause in conversation at a private event could morph into speculation about a secret affair. For Meghan, this external pressure added another layer of complexity. Her private reflections were no longer entirely private. They were being scrutinized, interpreted, and weaponized in ways that created both emotional strain and public curiosity. Palace insiders, often more subtle but equally influential, began piecing together a narrative based on observations, timing, and confidential interactions. These were individuals with access to hallways, private events, and intimate moments, capable of observing patterns invisible to the general public. Their accounts painted a picture of Meghan increasingly preoccupied, thoughtful, and, in some moments, visibly conflicted. A secretary might note her lingering at a window, lost in thought. A security officer could remark on her distracted manner during routine walks through the estate. To the casual observer, these were minor details. To those with context, they were signals of an emotional storm brewing. The opinions of insiders varied widely. Some expressed concern for Harry, noting that he remained unaware of the depth of Meghan's internal struggle. Others focused on Meghan herself, recognizing the tension between her public role and personal desires. One insider described her as a woman grappling with the weight of expectation while simultaneously discovering new possibilities she hadn't considered before. These conflicting perspectives created a fog of uncertainty, where truth and speculation intertwined, leaving Meghan's intentions ambiguous to everyone but herself. And yet, among the voices, certain themes emerged consistently. First, there was the recognition of Meghan's intelligence and emotional acuity. She was not easily swayed. Her responses, even in private communications, were deliberate, calculated, and reflective. Second, there was acknowledgement of her vulnerability to influence, particularly from individuals who represented freedom, wealth, and emotional validation. Finally, there was the understanding that these interactions were consequential. Every whisper, glance, and message had the potential to reshape the dynamics of her marriage and public perception, creating a ripple effect that could extend far beyond the palace walls. Even within her inner circle, tensions arose. Advisors who had previously been supportive began expressing subtle concerns. They warned about the risks of secrecy, the dangers of external influence, and the consequences of allowing private desires to escalate into action. Meghan, however, was determined to navigate these waters on her own terms, balancing curiosity, excitement, and caution with remarkable finesse. She was aware of the stakes, but equally aware that denying her own feelings could lead to regret, stagnation, or emotional depletion. The conflict extended beyond those immediately surrounding her. Extended family members, distant relatives, and social acquaintances all had perspectives to share. Some were protective of Harry, cautioning Meghan about the implications of acting on her impulses. Others, drawn to intrigue, offered encouragement, fueling the tension and amplifying the stakes. Every conversation, every subtle suggestion, became a layer in a complex tapestry of influence, persuasion, and emotional intensity. In parallel, the media ecosystem amplified every hint, rumor, and statement. Journalists analyzed body language, social media posts, and public appearances, interpreting them through lenses of scandal, speculation, and curiosity. One minor misstep, a delayed wave, a distracted smile, could become evidence in a growing narrative that Meghan was torn between loyalty and desire. The constant public gaze transformed private musings into a form of performance pressure, intensifying the psychological and emotional stakes she already faced. The cumulative effect of these voices, friends, foes, insiders, and the media, was profound. Meghan's private life, once a space for reflection, contemplation, and self-direction, became a theater of speculation. She had to navigate not only her own emotions but also the expectations, warnings, and judgments of a complex network of observers. Every choice, every internal reflection, was now influenced by a broader audience, each with their own perspective, agenda, and interpretation. At the same time, the billionaire remained a steady, magnetic presence. His attention, subtle but deliberate, continued to provoke curiosity and reflection. In the midst of external commentary and scrutiny, Meghan found in him an echo of the life she could imagine. A life marked by autonomy, excitement, and possibility. And as her interactions with him deepened, the tension between private desire and public obligation intensified, creating a potent emotional cocktail that threatened to overwhelm even her considerable self-control. The narratives offered by friends and insiders began to converge around one central theme. Meghan's world was changing, and she was both the agent and the subject of that change. Her desire for autonomy, excitement, and self-expression could no longer be contained by the boundaries of royal life. And while Harry remained unaware of the full scope, those closest to Meghan sensed the growing gravity of her internal struggle. This chapter of the story reveals something fundamental about human behavior: the power of influence, the allure of validation, and the tension between desire and duty. Meghan's interactions with the billionaire, her private reflections, and the commentary from those around her created a perfect storm. A situation where internal conflict, external pressure, and latent ambition collided with explosive potential. And yet, for all the insight, speculation, and analysis, one question remained unanswered. How would Meghan respond when faced with the ultimate choice? Would she continue to navigate her emotions in private, maintaining a delicate balance between loyalty and longing? Or would the growing tension, the secret communications, and the whispers from friends and insiders push her toward action? Because in a world where private desires are amplified by scrutiny, curiosity, and opportunity, hesitation is often the prelude to revelation. And Meghan's next move, already gestating in private reflections and subtle communications, would soon demand attention, action, and ultimately, confession. But what came next would be far more dramatic than anyone, insider or observer, could have predicted. Why Meghan was tempted by a world Harry couldn't provide is a question that cuts to the heart of desire, ambition, and human curiosity. On the surface, Prince Harry offered love, loyalty, and stability, a foundation that many would consider unshakable. But the Arab billionaire presented something entirely different. A universe unbound by rules, a playground of wealth and freedom, and a lifestyle so intoxicating that even the most disciplined mind could feel its gravitational pull. For Meghan, whose every day was dictated by protocol, scrutiny, and public expectation, this world represented more than temptation. It was a glimpse of what life could feel like when every constraint was lifted. The billionaire's lifestyle was an almost mythical construct, a blend of opulence, power, and discretion that few outside his circle had ever witnessed. He owned sprawling estates in multiple continents, yachts that seemed to float between countries, private jets that could whisk him anywhere at a moment's notice, and access to exclusive social circles where influence was currency and visibility was optional. This was not the curated, constrained world of royalty. This was freedom with a price tag so high it became invisible. For Meghan, who had long navigated the ceremonial and sometimes suffocating routines of royal life, the contrast was stark. At the palace, her days were structured with meetings, engagements, and public appearances, all tightly choreographed to meet expectation and tradition. Every word spoken in public was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized. Every choice carried ramifications not only for herself and Harry but for an entire institution centuries in the making. The billionaire's world, by contrast, offered spontaneity, anonymity, and, crucially, autonomy. He could offer experiences that Harry, bound by duty, protocol, and the public eye, could not. Imagine the difference. A weekend retreat on a private island with no cameras, no schedule, no expectation. A conversation over dinner with influential global figures who treated Meghan as an equal rather than a title. The thrill of exploration without constraint or judgment. For someone whose personality was ambitious, curious, and deeply invested in personal expression, the allure was undeniable. It was not about materialism alone. It was about freedom, validation, and a chance to live authentically. Insiders who observed Meghan during this period noted subtle changes in her behavior. Her demeanor shifted from one of measured composure to a quiet, reflective excitement whenever the billionaire's world was mentioned, even indirectly. Conversations that were once tightly controlled became more open, revealing a mind considering new possibilities, weighing options, and imagining a life unconstrained by protocol. Every gesture, every pause, every subtle smile hinted at the internal tension that now dominated her private reflections. The billionaire himself was not a passive participant in this psychological dynamic. Every gesture, every interaction, was carefully calculated to emphasize allure without overt pressure. Gifts, invitations, and subtle communications were curated to stimulate curiosity, evoke desire, and amplify the contrast between Meghan's current life and the possibilities before her. And Meghan, fully aware of the stakes, could not help but be drawn in by the experience. The combination of sophistication, mystery, and unspoken promise created an intoxicating cocktail that challenged her loyalty, patience, and resolve. At the same time, the world outside the billionaire's sphere remained an omnipresent weight. Harry's love and concern were constant, though often limited to the realities of royal duty and public expectation. The media continued to scrutinize every appearance, every comment, and every nuance, creating a duality where Meghan existed in two overlapping realities. One visible and highly controlled, the other private and filled with possibility. Navigating these realms required constant vigilance, emotional acuity, and a willingness to explore desires that could not yet be publicly acknowledged. Friends and insiders noticed this growing fascination with the billionaire's world. Some expressed concern, cautioning Meghan about the emotional risks, the potential fallout, and the moral complexities of pursuing curiosity while married. Others were intrigued, observing the transformation with fascination, noting the spark in her demeanor, the renewed energy in her private interactions, and the reflective, almost dreamlike quality of her conversations. The contrast between Harry's structured, protective love and the billionaire's liberating attention was palpable, creating tension, excitement, and internal conflict in equal measure. The billionaire's lifestyle was also a lesson in power dynamics. Unlike Harry, whose influence was bounded by institution, history, and public scrutiny, the billionaire moved freely, shaping his environment with authority and discretion. To Meghan, this represented a form of empowerment unavailable in the rigid hierarchy of royalty. Witnessing someone operate with such autonomy, control, and influence while simultaneously